Hello and welcome back to day 3 of Raising Climate Ambitions with Biochar. I'm Daniel with the virtual event production team, We and Goliath, and I'm just going to give you a quick couple tips about how to navigate the platform, make sure you're comfortable getting around and connecting with other attendees, speakers, and sponsors. So let's go. On the homepage, you'll see this friendly reminder about our event participation contest. So the most active attendees will win one of these 3 prizes: a copy of a burn book by IBI's own Kathleen Draper, a Biochar t-shirt or magnet. So you can find your score, your current score, in the leaderboard down here or in the sidebar. On the reception page, you'll also see that Pro Earth is doing a live demo today at 1 o'clock during the virtual networking session. So don't miss that if you're interested. You can connect to that right here or on the rooms page. You can also talk to IBI, all of our sponsors, or discuss with other attendees and possibly speakers from today's sessions in the rooms during, again, the 1 p.m. networking session. So, of course, your full agenda is here on the agenda tab. Like you just did, click join session to join each session. Okay, so between sessions, you have to click back to agenda, scroll to the session, and click join session. If you haven't yet, make sure to check out all of the wonderful sponsors. Clicking on their booths here, you can drop your contact details, chat with them, switch between them, and get engaged, get involved. Okay, so you feel free to chat, send meeting requests, explore downloads, etc. Also, during the 1 hour virtual networking, we have some open networking sessions. Just grab a virtual chair for coffee, just for fun, or for networking. And you can send those one-on-one messages as well as meeting requests to any speaker or attendee with these tabs on the people page. Okay, I hope you have a great last day. Over to you, Wendy.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the global audience joining IBI's 2022 Symposium on our 3rd and final day. We have 5 diverse panels to explore scaling roadmaps for biochar today. Before we begin, I'd also like to thank the 2022 Symposium sponsors again, including Pro Earth, Carbon Future, and Pyreg. Please make sure to connect with them in the networking time and visit all of the sponsors' websites to learn more about their important work. And I want to congratulate our current top winners for the prizes for the most engaged attendees. We'll reach out to whoever are the top 3 at the end of the event to send them their gifts. We're going to start today by hearing from our headline sponsor, Pro Earth, which, as a reminder, will have a demonstration room as well during networking time today.
The core of Nasdaq ESG strategy is to support our customers, corporates and investors in their own ESG journey and to help them achieve their own ESG target. We came across Pro Earth and we were really intrigued by their innovation.
Net zero is very difficult to achieve without removing CO2 physically from the atmosphere. We've created an instrument called CO2 Removal Certificate, or CORC. It's a digital tradable asset that represents 1 ton of CO2 removed from circulation. Companies can purchase that and use that to neutralize their emissions.
The whole process starts from the forest. We start by logging the trees. We do this predominantly in the wintertime when there's minimum disturbance to animals and the forest ecosystem. Those are then transported to our factory where we chip them and dry them before we feed them into the carbonizer. Biochar can be used as a soil amendment to reduce the leaching of nutrients from agriculture.
Biochar is really safe and simple way to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere because we are turning carbon dioxide into carbon, which is a really stable way of storing it. And something else for the future, carbon foam. It's a really lightweight insulation for space rockets when we start colonizing the Mars.
We'll have liftoff.
Our partnership with Nasdaq enables us to scale the carbon removal market and thus helps the world to reach its climate goals.
Thank you so much. As we begin with our first panel, we reflect that biochar's inclusion in IPCC reports as a carbon removal technology has been in some ways transformational for the industry. And we are really extraordinarily fortunate for our first speaker's long-standing work advocating for biochar. Dr. Annette Cowie is a lead author in the IPCC 6th Assessment Working Group 3's report on climate change mitigation, a former IBI board member and senior principal research scientist for climate at the University of New England in Australia. She'll be discussing the role of high-level policymakers in scaling biochar's climate impact. Over to you, Annette.
Sorry about that, folks. I have finally figured out how to unmute myself, and I'm just checking, are my slides on the way, please? As they're arriving, I'll just let you know that I was invited today to talk on this rather specific topic of reaching IPCC negotiators and other climate policy makers. And so I'm going to share some insights based on my experience as an author of the 6th Assessment Report. I was very lucky to be involved as an author on chapter 12 on cross-sectoral perspectives. So next slide, please. The IPCC was established in 1988 by UNEP and the World Organization, and it's an UN body, so it's open to all member countries of the United Nations, and it currently has 195 member governments. Next slide, please. The role of the IPCC is to sit on the science policy interface. It's to assess the science on human-induced climate change and its potential impacts and options for adaptation and mitigation. The IPCC does not conduct science itself, it synthesizes the scientific literature. And it provides information that's used by the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, in its decision-making. The IPCC reports are intended to be neutral, policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. It's a bit of a mantra of the IPCC. Next slide, please. And in case you're wondering how decisions of a UN body might be relevant to you as individuals or companies, well, many countries around the world, you've possibly noticed, it's around 140 now, have implemented or are discussing taking on a net zero target as part of their commitment under the UNFCCC, in particular under the Paris Agreement. And so they're busy devising plans on how to achieve these net zero targets through national policies and programs, which certainly have an influence on people in those countries. Next slide, please. And awareness of the findings of the IPCC on the urgent need to reduce emissions and aim for net zero has spawned initiatives at the industry level, including various standards and schemes supporting the many companies that are seeking accreditation as carbon neutral or adopting net zero targets, including the various platforms on the voluntary carbon market that creates offset credits. And in this market, there's a growing preference for removal offsets, having recognised the need for removals in order to achieve net zero. And that's creating opportunities for biochar because biochar is seen as more durable than carbon stored in soil and vegetation offsets, for example. Next slide, please. There are also current initiatives to enhance the integrity of the carbon market. You've possibly heard concerns about various carbon credits out there and how real they are. And so there are initiatives at the moment to support enhanced integrity in the carbon market. And there are also emerging requirements for companies to make climate disclosures. And this is going to certainly increase the demand for high integrity carbon offsets. And all of this is likely to lead to increased demand for carbon offsets from biochar projects. Next slide, please. So back to how the IPCC works. The major decisions are taken at plenary sessions of the government representatives. Each of the countries sends a delegation, 1 to a dozen people or more, usually headed by the Foreign Affairs Department, and most of the delegates are from the Environment Departments, with very few from Agriculture. The delegates are mostly career bureaucrats, UNFCCC negotiators, and very few have a background in the physical sciences. The IPCC structure comprises 3 working groups and a task force, and these are each supported by a technical support unit. Working Group 1 deals with the physical science basis for climate change. Working Group 2 focuses on climate change impacts and adaptation. And Working Group 3, the one I was involved in, works on mitigation of climate change. The working groups each prepare assessment reports and special reports, whereas the task force on national greenhouse gas inventories does exactly what the name suggests. It develops and refines methodologies for the calculation and reporting that's undertaken by countries producing their national greenhouse gas inventories. Next slide, please. So producing an IPCC report takes quite some time. In the case of the 6th assessment report, that was even longer due to COVID. But the preparations for the 6th assessment report started with the scoping meeting in 2017, which produced an outline for the report. And after that, the authors were selected. So the authors are selected from scientists all around the world, nominated by governments and the observer organisations. The IPCC Bureau selects from amongst the nominees to achieve a balanced representation considering geography, gender, discipline and career stage. The authors then get together, usually 4 times in a face-to-face meeting, in our case, twice face-to-face and twice virtually, during the preparation of the report. And there's 2 rounds of review. This is a very serious, comprehensive review. The documents are put out to anybody who wants to nominate as an expert and also the government to provide comments. And the comments are received and taken very seriously. We get thousands of comments and each one has to be responded to. And our response to the comments, particularly if we disagree with it and don't take on the proposed change, is then made public. So we take this very seriously. And finally, once we have the report ready, the final draft, it goes to the approval process. And once it gets through there, it's eventually published. But next slide, please. I'd just like to talk a little about the approval process. So these are images from the approval process for the special report on climate change and land, on which I was an author, but not part of the summary for policymakers. As you can possibly see, it's a rather intense process. When they do it face-to-face, it's a 5-day meeting with 2 days spare, and it usually does go into the 6th and often 7th day. And during this process, it starts by the governments making statements about their views on the draft summary for policymakers. The idea of the whole approval process is that the government representatives go through the summary for policymakers sentence by sentence, and they gavel down each sentence when they finally agreed on the text. Our summary for policymakers is a 60-page document, so that was rather tedious. And when we did it online, it took 2 weeks. So in that opening plenary, the governments make their remarks about their first impressions, and then the authors go away and make adjustments based on what they've heard, and there's a series of meetings. It's an iterative process, and finally, at the end of the 5, 6 or 7, or in our case 14 days, the document is approved by the plenary session. Next slide, please. So in the case of the Working Group 3 report, we had 278 authors from 65 countries. We also had 354 contributing authors, and between them, the authors cited work from more than 18,000 scientific papers, and we had to respond to 59,000 review comments. Next slide, please. And this is what the report looks like. There's 17 chapters plus annexes, and the whole thing is nearly 3,000 pages long. We certainly don't expect anybody to sit down and read it from cover to cover. Let's talk just a little about the key messages from the report. Next slide, please. What our report emphasises is some good news, that the rate of growth in emissions has slowed, but the key message is that we are not on track to meet the goal of the Paris Agreement. We are not on track to limit warming to 2 degrees, let alone well below 2 degrees. Next slide, please. What it also shows is that we're certainly not on track under current policies, but neither are we on track under the pledges, the net zero targets that the countries have announced. These pledges are just not enough. We are definitely going to need carbon dioxide removal to reach a net zero target. But there's some more good news. There are many mitigation options that are available and affordable, and many of them also have co-benefits for sustainable development. But on the other hand, there are often trade-offs as well that need to be managed. The land sector certainly has a key role to play, but it can't do it all. We certainly need to focus first on emissions reduction. Next slide, please. There's a key statement in the summary for policymakers that emphasises the need for carbon dioxide removal. The deployment of carbon dioxide removal to counterbalance hard to abate residual emissions is unavoidable if we're going to meet net zero. And certainly biochar has a role to play here. Next slide, please. The IPCC reviewed many different scenarios and trajectories that could get to net zero. And these strategies include a combination of the various mitigation options, including various amounts of carbon dioxide removal, focus on non-CO2 emissions, different reliance on bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, for example. But they all involve a fair contribution from the land sector. But I would also note that these scenarios come from the integrated assessment models, and the integrated assessment models currently do not include biochar. There are a couple of groups that are talking about it and wanting to include biochar in their models, but currently these models don't have biochar, so these scenarios that I'm showing here don't include the option of biochar. Next slide, please. But let's talk about how biochar is included in the 6th assessment report. It's mentioned a whole 188 times across the 3,000 pages, which is a whole lot more attention than it's received in any previous report. In particular, Chapter 7 has a section just about biochar. It's only 1.5 pages long, but that's actually a considerable amount of attention compared to and commensurate with the space that's devoted to soil carbon management and agroforestry, for example. The other important part is Chapter 12, the one I was involved in, where we have a large section that's about carbon dioxide removal and what they call a cross-chapter box, which meant that authors from across the whole report were involved in developing this text on carbon dioxide removal. Next, please. So this is a rather dense piece of text, and I'm sorry about that, but this is the section on biochar from Chapter 7. I actually led the drafting of this text, and it reviews very briefly what we know about biochar, what previous IPCC reports have said about biochar. But then it has this conclusion, which I think is rather useful. It talks about the significant mitigation potential through carbon dioxide removal that biochar can offer, the fact that it improves soil properties and also enhances productivity and resilience to climate change. And most importantly, it says that there's medium agreement and robust evidence for this. And it talks about that there's up to a technical potential of up to 6.6 gigatons of CO2 per year by about 2050. Next slide, please. Chapter 12, as I said, has a section on carbon dioxide removal. It shows this stylized trajectory of a pathway to get to net zero, emphasizing the need to reduce emissions, but also to ramp up carbon dioxide removal in the green below the line in order to achieve net zero. Next slide, please. It reviews all of the different carbon dioxide removal methods and includes text on technology readiness level, mitigation potential, costs, risks, impacts, and co-benefits. And it presents this taxonomy that categorizes carbon dioxide removal methods, not according to the commonly seen categories of nature-based and technological, for example, but a more what we felt was objective way, looking at the removal process, that being biological, chemical, or geochemical, and the duration of storage from decades to millennia. It's kind of a matrix. And I think that's helpful for biochar because biochar is tending to be classed as a hybrid and then maybe not seen as so favourable as the natural nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. Chapter 12 also emphasises how biochar can be integrated with other land-based mitigation strategies to give synergistic outcomes with production and environmental outcomes. Next slide, please. So I hope you've got the impression that the text in the report conveyed a fairly positive message about the mitigation potential and co-benefits of biochar. And this was reflected in the draft summary for policymakers that went out just prior to the approval process. So I must say, I was rather taken by surprise when the opening remarks from the governments and then follow-up remarks in more detailed sessions later were highly negative about biochar. One after another, the government representatives stood up and said, virtually that is of course, and said that they didn't like to see these positive mentions of biochar. They wanted it either removed or to have caveats added. And as I said, this did rather take me by surprise. And I think this is why Kathleen thought it might be interesting for me to talk to you about the process. What you're seeing here is actually an excerpt from the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, which summarised what happened at the IPCC session. They produced summaries of all the convention's various meetings. It's a really useful document. Next slide, please. So I tried to understand what it might be that's behind these concerns that were being raised. And I recalled that in the special report on climate change and land, which focused on the very close relationship between climate change and land degradation, it emphasised how this is a vicious cycle at the moment, but that if we introduce sustainable land management practices, we can contribute simultaneously to improving the land productivity, addressing land degradation, and also mitigating climate change. Next slide, please. The report identified many sustainable land management practices that can contribute simultaneously to mitigation, adaptation, and food security, for example. But it also called out biochar, as well as afforestation and bioenergy, as having potential for risks as well as opportunities. And I think this was what was in the minds of the policymakers. They were concerned that if demand for biochar led to a large amount of biomass crops being grown, this might displace food production, for example. So they were concerned about food security impacts. Next slide, please. So the outcome of our negotiated process was some text in the summary for policymakers, which has some positive statements, some others that aren't so positive. So here it acknowledges the mitigation potential from biochar, but it also talks about the potential risks if poorly implemented. Next slide, please. And it does, I'm very pleased to say, acknowledge the greater durability of carbon stored in biochar, the fact that it's less prone to reversal than carbon stored in soil carbon management and vegetation, for example. But we were only able to keep the text that said that biochar can improve soil quality and food production capacity, as long as we also agreed to this footnote that referred to the potential risks, knowledge gaps due to the relative immaturity of use of biochar as a soil amendment and unknown impacts of widespread application. I wasn't at all happy about that, but it was a negotiated outcome, as I say. Next slide, please. So what can we do about it? We know that biochar can indeed be a win-win-win for climate, for ecosystem services and for productivity and resilience, but it definitely seems that the policymakers are not convinced. They're apparently unaware of the recent scientific advances in understanding of biochar, and they perceive variable results as evidence of uncertainty. They're unaware of the knowledge and experience that's being generated by the community of biochar users. So they don't have confidence to make policy to incentivize biochar. They don't think it's safe and they doubt its mitigation potential. So these are some suggestions for how we might overcome that situation. For a start, while we can be enthusiastic, we shouldn't oversell biochar. We need to be realistic about what it can and can't do. We need to work with policymakers to develop quality assurance processes to overcome their concerns about environmental risks and variable responses. And we need to demonstrate cost-effective and sustainable biochar systems. Next slide, please. And for the researchers in particular, we need to package the science in a way that it's digestible for policymakers who don't have much time to read scientific papers. We need to get across the message that we do know enough to upscale biochar, despite the fact that there are still some research questions that we need to look into. Next slide, please. This paper is an example of our response to finding out that the policymakers were unsure about biochar. This was an attempt to synthesize the 20 years of biochar publications to explain what biochar does in soil and how it influences plant growth. It was published last year in Global Change Biology, Bioenergy, how biochar works and when it doesn't. Next slide, please. And so, besides packaging the science, we need to acknowledge the concerns of the policymakers and, as I say, work with them to overcome those concerns. We need to explain the measures that we do have in place already for quality control through the various standards and certification processes. And we need to help them to understand that there are, in fact, methods available for quantification of mitigation, and these are based on high quality science. In fact, they have an annex in the guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories that shows how to quantify stable carbon in biochar. And this is the basis for the quantification methods in the voluntary carbon markets now. So the message is that biochar is ready for emissions trading, it's already happening, and it can be included in national inventory reporting. Next slide, please. And so my message to you all is, without being overly enthusiastic so that we come across as zealots, we need to convey the message that from Kathleen and John, that biochar is safe, scalable and shovel ready. The science is clear, biochar can play a significant role in climate change mitigation, and we do know enough to be able to match biochars to sites for optimal outcomes. The need for carbon dioxide removal as opposed to emissions reduction is now understood in order to get to net zero. So spread the good news that biochar is safe and durable carbon dioxide removal solution that can deliver multiple benefits to the society and the environment. Thank you.